the Canadian dollar went up. Read that again. On the day the United States threatened Canada with a 34% tariff on every auto part, every steel shipment, every aluminum roll crossing the border, the Canadian dollar did not crash. It ticked upward. The markets were not afraid of what Washington just did. The markets were afraid of what Ottawa is about to do next. Because in less than an hour, a 4-sentence government statement out of Canada sent SP 500 futures down 1.7%, Dow futures down 2.1%, and put 420,000 American jobs in the direct blast radius of a trade war that the White House just made dramatically worse. Mark Carney did not panic. Mark Carney walked out. And the question every auto worker in Michigan, every energy consumer in Wisconsin, and every Republican senator facing a midterm election needs answered right now is, did the United States government just make the worst economic miscalculation in a generation, and do they even know it yet? To understand what actually happened, we need to reconstruct the documented sequence of events against the backdrop of a trade conflict that has been escalating since Trump's return to office. The 2025 to 2026 U.S.-Canada trade war has its structural roots in the Trump administration's Section 232 tariffs, which imposed a 25% levy on Canadian automobiles and auto parts beginning April 2, 2025. Canada retaliated within days with matching 25% countermeasures on U.S. vehicles. Since then, the situation has deteriorated materially. As of early 2026, Canadian steel faces an effective 50% tariff under a tightened enforcement regime that has closed most USMCA exemption pathways. The economic damage is already documented and concrete. General Motors laid off approximately 700 workers at its Oshawa, Ontario facility and shuttered an electric delivery van plant in southwestern Ontario. Stellantis cancelled a Canadian Jeep production program entirely, shifting output to Illinois. In this environment, Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March 2025 having pledged to maintain retaliatory tariffs until the Americans, in his words, show us respect, traveled to Washington for what both governments publicly described as a comprehensive renegotiation framework discussion. According to reporting confirmed by market reaction data and Carney's subsequent public statement, those talks collapsed rapidly. Carney's office released a 4-sentence statement indicating that Canada was initiating a comprehensive review of cross-border trade dependencies, with particular focus on critical energy exports and rare earth supply chains. His comment to reporters outside the Canadian embassy, that the Canadian economy is built on resources the world needs, and the American economy is built on consumers who need those resources, was transmitted across financial newswires within minutes. Global markets responded before any official U.S. government statement was issued. That sequencing, markets moving on Carney's words while Washington remained silent, is itself a data point about where traders assessed the leverage to be sitting. The structural context for this confrontation runs considerably deeper than the current administration's tariff calendar, and understanding that context is essential to grasping why the market reaction unfolded the way it did. The U.S.-Canada economic relationship is, by virtually every measurable metric, the most integrated bilateral trade relationship in human history. A single automobile assembled in the United States crosses the Canadian border an average of 7 times during production, with components moving back and forth for machining, precision assembly, and electronic integration at each stage. The Fulcrum's analysis of the current tariff regime estimates that because parts cross the border multiple times, retaliatory tariffs have already contributed to effective per-vehicle cost increases of between $4,000 and $10,000 on North American assembled models. The 1988 Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and its successors, NAFTA, and then USMCA, were constructed on the explicit premise that this integrated supply chain was a mutual economic asset so valuable that neither side would rationally destabilize it. That premise is now under direct structural challenge. The USMCA faces its mandatory 6-year review in 2026, a process that could lead to renewal, modification, or collapse of the agreement Trump once called the biggest and most important trade deal in U.S. history. Carney flagged this explicitly at a Toronto auto plant visit in early February, observing that the original intention of eliminating tariffs across North America is, in his words, no longer the priority for the U.S. administration. His government has simultaneously been building alternative trade architecture, a deal with China allowing a capped number of Chinese EVs into Canada at a 6.1% tariff rate, a framework agreement with South Korea to establish Korean EV and battery manufacturing in Canada, and, documented by Bloomberg's February 17 analysis, a broad pivot toward Asian markets specifically designed to reduce Canadian industrial dependence on American trade access. The strategic logic driving these moves is not difficult to read. If the United States is going to treat Canadian industrial capacity as a competitive threat rather than a shared asset, Canada will build the market relationships required to operate without American trade as a survival necessity. The multidimensional analysis of this confrontation requires examining 5 distinct planes simultaneously, because the full economic and political stakes only become visible when those planes are mapped together. On the legal and trade law dimension, Trump's tariffs on Canadian auto and steel products were imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which authorizes presidential tariff action on national security grounds. Legal scholars and WTO dispute resolution panels have repeatedly questioned whether Canada, a founding NATO ally, constitutes a cognizable national security threat under that statute's plain meaning. The House of Representatives passed a resolution in February 2026 formally rebuking the administration's tariffs on Canada, signaling that the legal and political justification faces bipartisan challenge in Congress itself. Canada's retaliatory framework is structured under the same national security architecture, giving Carney the legal infrastructure to impose energy export review requirements, pipeline recertification, transmission line environmental compliance review, critical mineral export licensing, without technically interrupting supply, but generating the regulatory uncertainty that produces identical market pricing effects. The legal escalation toolkit available to Canada is, in this specific respect, more surgically targeted than Washington appears to have anticipated. On the political and power dynamics dimension, the political arithmetic of this dispute is unusually legible. The jobs most immediately at risk from auto supply chain disruption are concentrated in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, states Trump carried in 2024 by margins under 3 percentage points. The United Auto Workers, which historically cheers presidential trade protection announcements within hours of their release, has been conspicuously and publicly silent on the current tariff escalation. Check their press release archive. Check their social media. Nothing. That silence is a form of communication directed specifically at Republican legislators in the states where UAW members vote. The House's February 11 rebuke vote indicates that Republican congressional unity on this specific issue is already fracturing under constituent pressure. Carney's Davos speech, in which he called on smaller nations to band together against the economic coercion of great powers, was not diplomatic oratory. It was a strategic message to Republican senators in Michigan and Wisconsin: the pressure Canada will apply will reach your constituents before it reaches the Oval Office. He outsourced the political pressure. He made Trump's own electoral coalition do the negotiating. On the economic and financial dimension, the supply chain arithmetic is the number that cuts through everything else. A 34% tariff on auto parts that cross the border multiple times during production does not produce a 34% cost increase per vehicle. The effective cost multiplication, documented by Fulcrum's analysis of the current 25% tariff regime, already reaches $4,000 to $10,000 per vehicle depending on model complexity. A 34% rate would push those figures materially higher. Canada supplies approximately 61% of the crude oil flowing into the Great Lakes refining region, feeding facilities in Toledo, Detroit, and Chicago that supply fuel to Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana. Energy export review processes, even slow-moving, administrative track ones, inject risk premiums into futures contracts that translate into consumer price increases well before any physical supply disruption occurs. The Federal Reserve faces a specific and uncomfortable policy bind. Energy-driven inflation of the kind that Canadian supply uncertainty produces is not addressable through demand suppression without triggering recession conditions in precisely the manufacturing states already absorbing job losses. Treasury bond yields moved upward in the immediate aftermath of Carney's statement, as fixed-income investors began pricing in the probability that the Federal Reserve would face renewed inflation pressure requiring rate response. On the public opinion and media dimension, Carney's communication strategy has been calibrated with unusual precision for an American as well as a Canadian audience. His framing that there are some places that are not for sale became one of the most widely circulated political quotes of early 2026. His Davos characterization of the current moment, that the 80-year period in which the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership is over, was covered extensively by American media as a Canadian head of government narrating American institutional decline in real time, from a global stage, to a global audience. American public polling on Canada trade has not yet caught up with the pace of events. but the 2018 to 2019 steel and aluminum tariff episode produced measurable voter backlash in Midwest manufacturing states within 2 to 4 months of consumer price effects becoming visible. That timeline suggests the political consequences of the current escalation would land squarely in the pre-midterm window. On the international and comparative dimension, Canada's simultaneous trade diversification moves are being studied in Brussels, Seoul, and Tokyo as a potential operational model for how U.S. allies manage American trade coercion without direct rupture. The EU's CETA agreement with Canada provides a ready-made alternative trade framework requiring no new negotiation. Bloomberg's documentation of Canada's Asian auto industry pivot, announced publicly and with specific partner commitments, signals that the diversification process has moved from strategic aspiration to active implementation. If Canada demonstrates that decoupling from American trade dependence is economically survivable, it accelerates identical calculations in allied capitals already conducting them quietly. The stakeholder landscape in this dispute involves actors with sharply divergent interests, time horizons, and leverage positions that require individual analysis. Mark Carney's structural position is unlike that of most heads of government entering a trade confrontation. As former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, the official who managed Canada through 2008 without a single bank failure and Britain through the initial Brexit turbulence, he is accustomed to making high-stakes decisions under market pressure with explicit quantitative risk frameworks. He does not think in approval ratings. He thinks in leverage ratios and structural dependencies. His domestic political position also constrains his options in a specific direction. He leads a liberal government that came to power on an assertive economic nationalism platform. Backing down to Washington under pressure would be domestically terminal. His energy supply chain review strategy, threatening regulatory uncertainty rather than immediate physical supply cuts, is designed to maximize pressure on American corporate and congressional actors while preserving Canadian legal and diplomatic deniability on direct supply disruption. Peter Navarro and Robert Lighthizer represent the ideological architecture of the administration's trade approach, an approach built on the 1980s assumption that proximity to American consumers is so valuable that no rational trading partner would voluntarily risk losing access. That assumption structurally fails against a commodity exporter. Canada does not sell America goods Americans can source elsewhere. Canada sells America the inputs its industrial civilization runs on. The UAW and the broader U.S. manufacturing labor coalition represent the most consequential domestic political variable. Their silence is directed at Republican legislators in states where auto industry employment determines election outcomes. The Chamber of Commerce and the Auto Alliance, representing Ford, GM, Stellantis, and their supplier networks, have direct financial exposure measured in billions to every additional week of tariff uncertainty. Their lobbyists are currently the most active participants in the Republican congressional conversations that will determine whether legislative pressure forces a White House course correction before economic damage becomes irreversible. The affected American workers, the auto assembly employees, the parts manufacturers, the diner operators and real estate agents and school districts whose economic fate is downstream of factory employment, are the stakeholders with the least institutional agency and the most direct personal exposure. Looking ahead, the trajectory of this standoff will be shaped by the interaction of three variables: the pace at which economic consequences become visible to American consumers and voters, the degree to which Republican congressional unity fractures under direct constituent pressure, and whether Canada's trade diversification moves reach a structural threshold that makes the relationship's terms permanently less American-dependent regardless of how the immediate standoff resolves. The most probable near-term scenario, roughly 50% likely given current conditions, is what analysts might call the corporate circuit breaker. Auto industry executives, energy sector leadership, and the Chamber of Commerce apply concentrated pressure through Republican legislators sufficient to produce a face-saving negotiated pause. Canada offers symbolic concessions on dairy market access and a joint border infrastructure initiative. The tariff escalation halts, and both sides characterize the outcome as a win. This scenario preserves the core trade relationship but permanently alters its trust architecture. Every future negotiation begins with both sides having demonstrated that the relationship is fragile. A second scenario, perhaps 30% probable, involves the administration escalating further while Canada executes the energy supply chain review strategy. In this scenario, consumer visible energy price increases in northern states emerge within 4 to 6 weeks, producing political pressure on Republican senators in Michigan and Wisconsin that legislative action on executive tariff authority becomes a live congressional option. The House rebuke vote of February 11 suggests the legislative arithmetic for such a constraint is closer to available than the administration currently calculates. The third scenario, 20% probable but the most structurally consequential, is the realignment path Carney has been systematically building toward. Canada completes diversification infrastructure with the EU, Asian partners, and Latin American economies sufficient to reduce USMCA dependency from roughly 75% of exports to below 50% within 5 years. Once that infrastructure is operational, it does not reverse on a change of administration in Washington. Bloomberg's documentation of Canada's Asian auto pivot indicates this process has already moved from planning to implementation. What this week ultimately reveals is a direct empirical test of an assumption that has governed American trade strategy since the post-war economic order was constructed, that access to American consumers is so uniquely valuable that no rational partner would voluntarily risk losing it. Canada, under Carney, is running a structured challenge to that assumption, not through military confrontation, not through diplomatic rupture, but through the precise application of commodity leverage to the most economically sensitive points in the American industrial system. The outcome of that challenge will be studied in trade economics and political science programs for decades, regardless of how the immediate standoff resolves. For auto workers in Dearborn, energy consumers in Milwaukee, and Republican incumbents watching their 2026 electoral maps shift in real time, the stakes of that test are not theoretical. They arrive as a heating bill in January, a layoff notice in March, and a ballot in November. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. When the next move in this standoff breaks, and it will break within days, you will want the full structural analysis before the spin arrives. Leave a comment below with the one variable you think resolves this first: corporate pressure on the White House, consumer price pain in swing states, or Carney deciding his patience has run out.